Once we find out God likes us, we can start liking other people, blessing other people. So we've been on this journey, Lynn. Yeah, we're still on it. And the latest thing we've been doing the last several weeks, and I want to continue, is if God is so good as we say he is, as some of us say, then how do we handle some of the famous, infamous, well-known bad news verses in the New Testament particularly? If God is so good, then what do we do with certain passages in the New Testament that don't sound quite so good? Okay? And we've dealt with several of them already. I don't want to review too much, but no, I'm just not going to review it all. It'll come up in the course of our conversation, I'm sure. Here's the next big subject I want to tackle. If God's so good, how do we handle the bad news passages? And for this, I actually want to back up to the Old Testament. The very first week that we started this question, many people raised their hands and said, yeah, like what about Sodom and Gomorrah? What about Jericho? What about the flood? All of those sound like God's pretty mad, and when God gets mad, he kills people. That's sort of pretty conventional theology. Like, what's wrong with that? Isn't that obviously true? And I contend that no, that is what appears on the surface is not what is really going on a deeper level. And much of the same is true with the bad news of the New Testament. Wasn't God mad, and did he just kill him because he was mad? The answer is no. Now, again, for those of you who haven't been here as much, many times the Old Testament in particular, but even the New, uses language that the language is accommodated to our perception, to our level of perception. So the writer will say, the wrath of God burned against blank. That's Old Testament language in particular. And I believe that that's accommodative. Is that a word? Accommodative language. That's language geared to the theological toddlerhood of us readers, but that it's not actually what's going on. And again, I'll hasten to say, we would read the Old Testament. What's the word? Barefaced. We would read the Old Testament ipso facto. There it is. That's what it says. That's the truth. If it weren't for Jesus, who comes along and says, I'm just like the Father, and here's what the Father is like. And that really forces us to go back and reread the Old Testament. But one of the explanations for what is going on, I think, in all of that wrath in the Old Testament is simply one of the fundamental laws of the cosmos. And it's the law of cause-effect. Or if you want to sound a little bit more spiritual, you can say reaping and sowing. Reaping and sowing is one of the, I believe, incontrovertible laws of creation. That is how it works. What you reap, you will sow, or cause effect. So let me go back and let's just use our imagination, because obviously the text does not tell us these things, but I think knowing what we know from Jesus, we can go back and look at the Old Testament and say, okay, so what was happening? Let's take, for instance, the Battle of Jericho. And I was in a church a couple years ago where the preacher was preaching of the Battle of Jericho, and it was a very, very traditional approach. The children of Israel marched around, and the gates fell in, and the walls fell in, and all the men, women, and children were either crushed by a falling rock or killed by having their whatever gizzard slit by a Israelite sword. And all the boys and girls are supposed to go, yay! and it's like, of course, unless you're thinking. Unless you're thinking, then you go, kind of like, wrong luck for the Jerichoites, huh? That doesn't seem very nice, especially to the children. What did they do, right? Now, it just so happened that I was sitting in this church, and it turned out that I had an aunt. This is really rare, because the number of times I've been in a church with an aunt and uncle, you can count on maybe a hand and a half my whole life. But my aunt from California was visiting my mom and dad and sitting in their church. And my aunt is a raving California liberal almost atheist, just, one of those, okay? And so I'm listening to this whole sermon through her ears, the way you do. And I'm going, don't say that. I love my aunt. I want her to come to Jesus. But I'm thinking, this sermon is not helping at all. And I was exactly correct. This sermon did not help at all. She did not have anything good to say about that preacher. Even he's a wonderful, godly man. But he just was preaching to the choir. And he didn't know anybody but the choir was there. And so the obvious question is, well, again, a lot of these stories are great unless you think a little bit. And so what was really going on? The obvious fact is, the obvious misfact is, God was mad at the Jerichoites, and in his wrath, he killed them. That's fine, unless Jesus comes along and says, but God is kind to the righteous and the unrighteous, the wicked. And then you have to go, wow, I didn't think it was very kind like that. So anyway, I would put what happened at Jericho down to not, you've seen me do this so many times, but again, for those of you who haven't been here a while, or for those of you who are visiting, we tend to visualize a sin-mad zap sequence. Okay? We sin, God gets mad. It's weird. It's terrible. And so God zaps the person that sinned. And that's how our typical theology works. And all of you know, how do we fix this diagram? What is the one thing we do? Yeah, exactly. You simply take out this part of the diagram, and that's more accurate to what happens. And I think that's exactly what was happening, for instance, in Jericho. It was a sin zap sequence. It wasn't sin, God gets mad and zaps him. It's just cause effect. And a little bit of history and archaeology and Bible study makes it quite clear what was going on in Jericho for centuries, probably for centuries, at least for generations, before the Israelites showed up outside their gate. They had been worshiping Molech, or Molech, and Ashtoreth. And some of you have done your Bible study. What does that mean? It sounds so innocent to say, well, they were worshiping false gods. Well, yeah, until you find out what that worship entailed, right? Yeah. The iron
scabbard. Children literally walk in fire.
They would take an infant and put him on the red hot arms of the enemy, and he'd roll into the fire. So they were burning their infant children in worship of Ash. So, when you read, they were worshiping Ashtoreth or Molech, it can sound so until you find out what that entailed. Children passing through the fire. What the people of Israel were doing then for generations was yanking with all of their might on the chains of cause-effect. Now, how in the world and why the gears of cause-effect took so long to play out, I don't know. Maybe mercy. Maybe God's mercy is He keeps cause-effect from happening as quickly. It's forestalled. I've tried to parse this out, and I can't, because that brings up so many questions. So I don't pretend to have the answer to that. But I believe that's what was going on. They were yanking on the chains of cause-effect for generations. And when you yank on chains, the gears that those chains are hooked to turn. And for some reason, it took that long for the gears. And when the children of Israel came outside the gates, God said, okay, now's the time to let cause-effect take place. How did God feel about every man, woman, and child inside the city of Jericho? Yeah, exactly. Good picture. He loved them. And by the way, we really can't necessarily project